Everyone, happy Thursday. Welcome to the Growth Accelerator. I'm Nate Houghton, co-founder of Incendium, here with Dustin Amrhein from Revcast. Thanks for joining us, Dustin.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nate.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I think I was thinking about this ahead of time. There's probably too much for us to cover in the time we have. I think we have like a lot of interesting discussion we could have about the state of play in terms of sales funnels and growth for B2B companies. Always like to hear a little bit from founders themselves on how they started a company, and then anything you're seeing in your own growth as well would be cool. But to start, I'd be interested to hear more about, to share more about your background, how you founded this company, why you founded this company, where everything came from.
Yeah, so I'm background-wise, I'm a recovering software engineer. I started my career as a software engineer, and I did that for about 5 years, but I've spent the last 15 years really on the go-to-market side. And I've been fortunate, one, to work for a lot of great mentors, but two, to be able to really see the full revenue supply chain, from working on the pre-sale side, working on the sell side, to working on the post-sale side and everything that comes with that. And one of the things, especially at the last company I was at with some of my co-founders, I just saw this change that was happening in the sales market, where we were, and everybody's experiencing this in the B2B SaaS world in particular right now, where we're going from this growth at all cost mentality to, hey, I really need to be mindful about how we grow. And I really need to be mindful about efficiency as we scale. And it happened as an operator at the time. It felt like it happened overnight. There were probably a lot of signals that were out there in the market telling us this was coming. But I can tell you that myself, peers that I talked to in other companies, we really didn't have a playbook for this, right? We were left. I mean, we had a playbook for growth at all costs, which was, hey, focus on the quarter, and anything we can do to make the quarter better is good. We'll solve other problems when we get to them, and we'll solve them mostly by spending more money.
Right.
And it felt like overnight that changed.
Yeah, I think, and I can say, just to add from a service provider's perspective, I think we saw that from the other side of the coin as well, where, we had to reorient the nature of our offerings and the way we presented them to people to fit within that new model. I think that, I don't think we're fully adjusted yet, or at least I'm certainly not in terms of how I think about it, which has been interesting. But that's a good segue for Revcast. So what does Revcast do? Kind of what's the pitch? How does it fit within this new structure?
Yeah, and I totally agree with you, Nate. I don't think we're fully adjusted. I find myself not fully adjusted, but also just talking with CROs, CEOs every week, we're still in the early innings of this change, because let's face it, we spent the last 15 years in an entirely different model. But with Revcast, what we do, our main focus is on helping revenue leaders to optimize their spend to maximize revenue growth. And for us, and the way that we look at it, there are two main, there's a lot of ways that you spend money as a SaaS company, but on the revenue side, you primarily spend money on two things: on generating demand for your offering, and on people that will help you both generate and convert that demand into actual revenue. And we have a platform that helps these revenue leaders, not just when they're doing initial annual planning, which we all think about and mostly loathe the idea of going through that process, but also throughout the year, because let's face it, an annual plan is really just a lot of assumptions about how the year is going to unfold. This second that we start the year, we get into that first month, the path is going to change. So we focus on helping leaders understand, okay, how do I change? Where should I change where I'm spending money to generate demand? Where and how should I change? How am I aligning my people to that demand? Where am I hiring? Where am I not hiring? When am I hiring? And these are very, very consequential decisions. And that's what we do as a platform.
So this is a big problem. These are a bunch of big problems, obviously. So I'm curious, when you onboard a new customer or you're talking to a prospect, maybe what if anything were they doing about this before? Like what was their not as good solution before they had Revcast?
Yeah, I mean, so if we think about the world of sales tech,
yeah,
if I just asked you the state of sales tech, you'd probably say, hey, there's a lot of it, right? And there is. But most of it is focused on the front lines. Most of it is, how do I scale out my reps, my BDRs? How do I manage the pipeline in quarter and maybe for the next quarter? How do I help reps progress deals through that pipeline? There's very little that is focused on what I would call kind of the back office world of revenue. And what most of our customers are doing today is they capture their sales plan in a spreadsheet. They do all of their planning between the finance, sales, and marketing occurs in multiple versions of spreadsheets with 50 tabs, and it's really a disjointed mess. But then, so we do that in our platform. We capture that plan, all of the best practices, but we also monitor progress against that plan in real time. So we are integrated into your system in pulling out data and showing you, very importantly, in context, how you're progressing against the plan, highlighting risk and telling you what to do about those risks, what we suggest that you do in terms of how do I alter the plan or alter the way I'm operating. And today, this happens with an army of people, data analysts that are pulling data from multiple different locations, usually, again, dumping it in a spreadsheet, trying to compare it to the original plan, which is in yet another spreadsheet. And then, over some period of time, bringing back recommendations to the revenue leadership team or to the company leadership as to what should be adjusted. Because it's so manual, because it's so tedious and burdensome, we typically, as revenue teams, only do that like once a quarter at most.
At most,
right? QBR.
Yeah.
Preparing for a board meeting, maybe a half-year review. And it's just too slow in this market. We can't afford to be efficient. We don't have the luxury of just saying we'll deploy more cash to cover up inefficiencies.
Yeah. Can you give me an example? I'm sort of something piqued my interest that you mentioned where you're able to highlight risk areas or things where you might be missing that and then suggest some sort of corrective mechanism. Like how does that occur in practice? That's really interesting.
Yeah. I'll give you an example from a customer conversation I had literally last week. They're getting ready to wrap up their first quarter. They're looking at their hiring plan that they entered the year with. Their hiring plan, they have 2 segments, fairly simple go-to-market, enterprise, non-enterprise, enterprise and commercial, let's say. Their plan called to hire 2 more enterprise reps at the end of the second quarter, but their data told them that they didn't have enough pipeline there. They weren't converting it at the rate that they expected, and they need to go dig into pipeline quantity and quality. And so what we were able to highlight for them and tell them is you're better off if you hire an enterprise BDR, which is already in your plan, stick with that, defer these 2 enterprise hires, but add 1 to your plan in commercial, because that will more than cover the gap based on the performance that we're seeing in the platform. So it's about understanding, and we just typically don't do that. Like when it comes to hiring, I can tell you, like we go into the year, we have a hiring plan. And unless there are major top line deficiencies, we stick to that hiring plan, right? But we're able to dig in and understand not just, hey, don't hire, but where should you hire if you want to cover that gap up and still have a path to your targets at the end of the year.
Yeah, that's a great example. So in terms of companies that should work with you or should talk to you, like what are some signs that they're at a place where they're really good or kind of within your ICP, or are there any types of companies that you're like they're either too early or they wouldn't need Revcast for whatever reason? I'm interested in narrowing in on that a little bit.
Yeah, first of all, B2B SaaS, like the top level umbrella is primarily who we work with, though any B2B sales team over time, confident we'll be working with. But within that SaaS umbrella, where our prospects or ICP really is those that are feeling the pain of growth. So you're going from, I talk to a lot of companies that are going from founder-led sales to a new head of sales coming in, building out a team. You're going from maybe 3 or 4 reps to 8, 10, 11, you're kind of growing to the point where you're not just have a head of sales, but you'll have FLMs in place in that organization, and they're just having to navigate this growth. So I talk to a lot of those companies, and that's about like, how do I manage the growth? How do I, as a head of sales, ensure I have the confidence of my CEO, of my board? They understand not just what we're doing now, but what we're planning 12, 18 months out. That's usually the horizon for that style company. But then on the other end, I also talk to a lot of what I would call growth stage, so it's 50 plus sellers in an organization, and they are laser focused on maturing their operational capability, so that they have this, they've been through the pain many, many times of, handling this the way that it's traditionally been done. And they're looking for a better way, right? They're looking to make that step forward. It's kind of that the early adopter in the crossing the chasm paradigm that we're looking for.
Yeah. Just kind of a curiosity question from the founder's perspective is this what you thought you were building? Have there been any kind of major pivots along the way? I'm interested in whether this is more or less the vision that you guys had at the beginning.
It's some form of the vision, right?
Okay.
I think when we started frankly building in a slightly different period where we hadn't yet really embraced industry-wide this notion of efficient growth, and meaning that I don't mean to suggest that everybody's building a profitable company from the beginning, but they are much earlier in their life cycle thinking about efficient scaling, even if they're in hypergrowth mode. I talk to founders all the time, and that's all top of mind for them. We weren't quite there yet, and where we were originally focused, honestly, was more on quota coverage, quota deployment. Are we deploying quota on time? Which is still a critical element and still something that we do in our platform. But we've essentially, Nate, the way I described it is that's important, and that's a kind of a bounding reality. But then there are constraints that we started to account for, and there are other indicators that we started to account for, and we kind of grown into, well, this is really for a revenue leader. How do I hit my targets with the limited resources I have? There's always some limit, right? So I've got a limited set of resources. How do I hit my targets? And it's just helping them pull the right levers at the right time.
Yeah. And in terms of moving forward from here and on the product side of what you've built, like what are there vertical integrations? Are there sort of horizontal feature sets that you're going to build throughout? Like how do you see this evolving, and what are customers telling you they want next?
Well, I think it's interesting. So if we just talk to my customer base, there's a lot of forecasting tools out there, right? Like a lot of tools that talk about pipeline and giving you visibility into pipeline. But I think they mostly do that at a deal level, if that makes sense, right? They're looking at the aggregate of deals, and then ultimately they're thinking about which deals are going to convert and which aren't. There are fewer tools that are really helping you understand where should you invest and why in pipeline. So just broader pipeline management capabilities, which we've started adding, and I think I know we're going to continue to add. But then I look more broadly. I think there's a couple of areas, Nate. One is eventually we're going to break out of just SaaS, because if you have a field sales team and you're doing B2B sales, the same principles that we're applying here apply there, right? And so that's interesting to me. As is, how do we digitize other back office jobs to be done? Because I think there are powerful connections between these different jobs. Think about, like, if you looked at our solution today, you might say, and I would argue, but you might say, hey, you guys are really tackling sales capacity management. That's at our core. We do more than that, but that's at our core. If you think about sales capacity management, well, there's other things that come up with that. It's like, well, how do I segment my customer base and my target base? How do I manage accounts in the back end? How do I manage territories? How do I manage commissions? And I think these are all interrelated problems. And today, too often, unfortunately, they're kind of done in silos, and in some cases different, depending on the size of the company, different teams within RevOps, in some cases, different functions in finance versus sales, right? Like in terms of who owns the work for some of this. And I can tell you, having been on the operating side, I'm sure you've seen it a ton, is the lingua franca for all of that is spreadsheets. Right. Like we just pass spreadsheets around, like, hey, take a look at this spreadsheet. Hey, take a look at that one. And it's massively confusing.
Yeah. There's different versions and different teams and different vernacular.
And different assumptions. Yeah. Different vernacular. Like, I remember the first time I saw a spreadsheet in my career from finance. I'm like, I've got no idea, guys. I've got quota and I've got win rates. Like,
where do I put that? That makes sense. One question I just thought of, this is an impossible question to answer, but what's your view of this sort of growth at all costs versus efficient growth paradigm? Are we looking at something cyclical? Like, do we think this kind of goes back and forth a little bit, or do you think there's going to be some degree of this profitability piece that remains into the future? And maybe how does that affect the way that you think about growing, Revcast?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, most of these things are cyclical. I will say that it was interesting the way that investors thought about SaaS for a while, and we know that they thought about it that way. They prized growth over anything else because we were in a macro market that there weren't many growth opportunities, right? So that made a ton of sense. I do believe, though, that And again, not these companies aren't trying to be profitable from the very beginning,
Right.
but I do, and I talk to VCs and I talk to PE firms. I would say VCs are getting closer to PE firms.
Mm-hmm.
They're not there yet, but just in terms of mindset. And you see this because if you go to venture firms now, basically all of the big shops have started building what they call operating partner teams, which on the PE side is called value creation teams, essentially.
Right. Right.
And it's the same thing. And they're recognizing
and like
that, hey,
opportunity funds, right? Which are, like, how do I follow on? Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And we need to invest in helping our companies operate more efficiently. That's essentially what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that will stick at that level.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've made it almost 20 minutes without talking about AI. So I feel like we probably, I think that's a record for 2025. Do you buy into this paradigm shift with how that affects how we're building and growing SaaS, or is it really in terms of the pricing model, in terms of the growth strategy, is that kind of baked into some of the other shifts that we're talking about in terms of just company construction and finance?
I do believe, like, just in the revenue tech side and what's happening in the market, there's a ton of interesting things out there, but we talked about being in the early innings of the shift of, growth at all costs to efficient growth. We are in, pre-game warm-ups on the AI side in terms of knowing what sticks, right? Like, and knowing what's really going to work and create value for companies. But I do believe, and I looking at this from the product side of the house and building a product, that the way that you should think about building a product now has just fundamentally shifted, right? Like there's, to me, like we have this notion of, agents that are kind of exploding in the market now. And I think about that, and can I build different agents for all the jobs to be done that RevOps typically has to do and use it as a force multiplier for a RevOps team? But if I look at it in the context of product in general, there's far less work to do up front on the UX than the UI side now, because you can prove so much with these agents and then creating an adaptive UX and sort of interacting with your users through whatever means they want, through voice, through text, through Slack and Teams, through whatever email. People are, I believe, going to shift that way, and it's going to change the way that we think about an application. Yeah, I think going forward, right? And we're just going to think about hiring technology to do jobs for us, which is a little bit of a shift in my mind.
Yeah, I think it makes more sense anyway. And in some senses, that's closer to what we should be doing.
Yeah.
So before we go, I spend a few minutes just looking at your own company and talking about your own top of funnel. Like, obviously, we're a growth shop, and we think a lot about top of funnel B2B. What are you seeing in the market? Like, what's kind of moving for you guys right now? What's working? What's not working? What's shifted?
A lot of relationship selling, and I know that's a big buzz right now. But going beyond just selling to past customers that are now at a new company, which I love. 5 years ago was a huge deal. It still is a huge deal. But you have to have a certain amount of scale to pull that off, right? But the relationship selling in general, and technologies that are finding these connections that we're just not, how many people are you connected to on LinkedIn, Nate, right? Like, finding these things, right? Like that we're not aware of. It's like, oh, that person is doing this now. And boy, I haven't talked to them in like 5 years, but they're kind of in my ICP wheelhouse. Just unearthing these connections that we have and setting up warm referrals and all of the work that's going into what I would call version 2.0 of buying and intent signals. Like, that's fascinating. And then that's what we're leveraging right now, mostly for our top of funnel, outside of events, I would say.
Which are a version of a similar thing. I think events create affinity. This is almost embarrassing to admit. I set aside probably 20 minutes for myself every day, and I choose a random city on LinkedIn, type founder into the title, and I do exactly what you mentioned at a human level of like, oh, I didn't know that's cool. What she's up to. And I send these, like, that is a legitimate source of pipeline for us. Just kind of doing that, whether it's that person or someone they connect us with. But but I do think that, like, turning cold leads warm and then treating them like warm leads is a different motion than selling to cold leads in some ways. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Are you finding you're able to, obviously, well, I'll rephrase the question. I assume you're able to do this reasonably well as a founder. I think founders and CEOs are good at this and have some gravitas and know some people. Scaling that to the sales team seems harder to me. if only because of the simple fact that, if they reach out to someone and they try to develop affinity, it says business development or sales or whatever on their LinkedIn, and they can see who they are. Like, have you found tools or ways to scale that at that level? Or is it really just a matter of letting salespeople market themselves first?
Yeah. I mean, we are experimenting. I would say we're design partners with a couple of firms that are looking at the space and are, thinking about it. And it's been off and on for us, because you're right. Like, the most effective is if I just dedicate time, Nate. Like, at this stage, the most effective is if I just dedicate time and go and do it myself. But I am really, intrigued by, some of what you guys are doing, by some of what I've seen in the market. Like, I think technology that can help us better coalesce personal connections and intent signals kind of together,
Right,
that lead to more warm outreach, or that lead to a better request for an introduction to somebody that, you're connected with, that can introduce you. That's largely manual today. Some people are really good at it. Like, I've got to use a lot of brain power to get there, frankly.
yeah, me too.
Yeah. And so I'm really interested in the technologies that are focused on that.
Yeah, I had that situation where poor guy I talked to last week sent me a list. I was like, yeah, check my LinkedIn, right? See if I'm connected. I'll connect you if I can. He sent me a list of 10. Like, one of those people I actually could connect with, right? And I think there's some revealed intent, and then what to send to someone based on your affinity and their interest in you. I think it's in some ways harder than it's ever been, but we'll keep an eye on it. Yeah. Very cool. And anything else to add? Anything I should have asked but didn't, or is that more?
No, yeah, I was waiting for the AI question.
It did take longer than I thought it might. Yeah, it should have probably come sooner. But people tuned out, I'm sure, earlier. But thanks for joining us, Dustin. Really appreciate it. We'll keep an eye on Revcast. Website's revcast.com.
Yep.
Awesome.
Revcast.com.
revcast.com. Cool.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Nate.
All right. See you.